The conscience that does not exist in the unconscious, or why the image of God often speaks with the voice of our inner judge. We often like to imagine conscience as something authentic, pure, and deep, something that needs no explanation, something that will always point to the truth. Conscience is presented as something sacred, like a voice of the soul that functions without interruption, like an internal moral compass. It supposedly lives within us from birth, independent of upbringing, culture, or experience. But in psychoanalytic thinking, especially in the classical model of Sigmund Freud, this image collapses. Conscience is not innate, it is not deep, and even more so, it does not exist in our unconscious. How does the psyche organize itself? To understand what conscience is, we need to look at how the psyche is structured in psychoanalysis. Freud proposed two models: the levels of consciousness, conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. The structural model, id, ego, and superego, and the second model helps explain the mechanics of moral processes, id, it. This is the deepest and most ancient layer of the psyche. Here lives everything the psyche does not want to recognize: primal desires, instincts, aggression, sexuality, envy, and everything culture, family, and religion taught us to label as unacceptable. It is the world of pure I want, a world of impulses without morality, rules, or logic. It is unfamiliar with ethics, shame, or guilt. It simply exists inside us, in the dark, ego, I. This is our conscious self, the part that perceives the world, acts within it, tries to survive and adapt. The ego attempts to balance between the desires of the id, I want, the reality of the external world, I can, and the demands of the superego, I must. The ego is a builder of compromises, a diplomat, a strategist. It is the ego that becomes aware, reflects, experiences guilt, shame, and responsibility. And it is through the ego that we are capable of forming moral judgments. Superego, above I. This is the moral authority within the psyche. The superego forms during childhood from prohibitions, prescriptions, and norms we receive from parents, caregivers, teachers, culture, and religion. It is the voice that says, you must not. That's wrong. That's shameful. That's a sin. The superego absorbs our image of the ideal self, the moral authority, the idealized father, God, or other figures who watch and judge. But the superego is not always benevolent. It can be harsh, paranoid, unforgiving, and self-destructive. It is the inner judge that may demand the impossible and punish every smallest mistake. How does conscience arise? Here is the key. Conscience is not part of the id, and it is not directly a function of the superego. It arises in the ego, at the moment when the ego becomes aware of some desire, e.g., irritation, aggression, erotic fantasy, envy. And it encounters the prohibition of the superego, a rule within, I am not allowed to feel this. This is unacceptable. This would degrade me as a person, daughter, believer. That is the moment when guilt arises. Guilt is the product of the clash between desire and prohibition. Conscience is the emotional echo of that conflict. What if the desire is repressed? Freud showed that not all desires reach consciousness. Many of them are repressed, that is, pushed out of the ego into the depths of the unconscious. The reasons might be, I can't admit I envy my sister. I'm ashamed of wanting to cheat. I mustn't be angry at my mother. And then the desire lives on, but outside of awareness. There is no encounter with the superego, and therefore no guilt. Instead, panic attacks, displaced aggression, self-destruction, procrastination, sudden waves of shame without clear cause. The person suffers, but does not know why, because their conscience is turned off. not because it doesn't exist, but because no conscious confrontation occurred. And now, about God, people who believe in God often live with the deep conviction that God sees everything, even my thoughts. Nothing can be hidden from him. I am accountable to him. In psychoanalytic terms, God here appears as an external figure of the superego. The psyche projects its internal moral judge outward. So instead of thinking, I forbid this to myself, the person thinks, God forbids this to me. And this works, very powerfully. Faith creates a moral vertical. It provides structure, meaning, and boundaries. But there is another side. If all moral conflict is external, the ego does not develop the ability to experience guilt independently, nor to form its own judgments. Then, morality becomes automatic. A person follows rules without experiencing conscience. Conscience disappears as an ethical experience and turns into fear of punishment. This is no longer an internal compass, it is an external guard. That's why true conscience is not God watching. It is the moment when you yourself see what you want and do not run away. It is not shame imposed by culture, not guilt you're supposed to feel, and not morality because it's written. It is a personal encounter with shadow, with what is in you but does not match your ideals. It is your inner conflict, where there is a chance to become deeper, not just obedient. In summary, the unconscious does not contain conscience. It contains only desire. Conscience arises in the ego when it recognizes desire and confronts a moral prohibition. The superego can be kind or cruel and often acts without conscious awareness. The God we imagine as judge is often a reflection of our superego. Faith can support morality or replace it. True conscience is not external control, but an inner experience of responsibility. And perhaps the thing we call the voice of God is not a voice from the sky. It is yourself in the hardest moment when you weigh desire against morality and choose not to flee. That is conscience, the only real one.